Welcome back. All right, so I've talked about a couple teams in the East. Now I want to talk about a team in the West, and we're going to talk about the Minnesota Wild. Minnesota's an interesting team. Yes, they are. So they finished the season 46, 25, and 11. They finished 11th overall. They finished third in the division. They lose in the first round. So where's the interest? The interest comes from the fact that until late in the season, it looked like they had a good chance to finish first. And of course, you would have drawn Seattle in the first round. And going into the playoffs, I think most teams would have said we'd rather play Seattle than Dallas. No offense to Seattle, but that's how it would have been seen. The thing is, Minnesota falls off in the end. They finish third. And so a season that could have been remarkable becomes another story of a Minnesota franchise sputtering late, coming up short in the playoffs. And this has been an issue with Minnesota-based teams. And so the Wild have been a part of this storyline as well. So their goals scored per game a little bit low at 2.91. Their goals against was fantastic at 2.67 goals per game. And Philip Gustafsson having an absolutely crazy year, earning himself a pretty solid extension with the Minnesota Wild as a result. And so as Fleury might be going into the final season of his career, Gustafsson may very well get the lion's share of starts this coming season. I would think he probably does. But again, that is subject to change, right? So their power play, 21.4%, not awful. And their penalty kill was very good at 82%. So their special teams was solid overall. One thing with Minnesota, though, when it comes to those special teams, their power play can look fantastic for a couple weeks, and then it just dries up for a couple of weeks. So it's a matter of having that consistency, too, on their special teams, right? Now, the last time they made the playoffs was, of course, 2023. They made it this year. They did win a round, 2015. So we talk a lot about the Toronto Maple Leafs and how long they were in between first-round playoff wins. Minnesota is getting onto the cusp of that, where we're going to talk about, well, yeah, they make the playoffs, but they can't get out of the first round. That conversation gets louder every year. So Minnesota really needs to win a round this year should they make the playoffs. And that's a question mark out there for me as well, and I'll come to that. So they've never won a Stanley Cup, which is a storyline with Minnesota-based franchises. I will talk about that before this is done. But it would be nice to see Minnesota win. It'd be nice to see a championship going to that state, which has supported hockey for many decades. Minnesota is a natural place to have hockey, and it has been there for a very, very long time. Now, they deceptively have cap space, $1,643,079 according to Cap Friendly, but they still haven't signed Kalen Addison. So restricted free agents, yeah, Addison's still out there, and it's a matter of how much he's going to make and for how long. Addison found himself on the outs on that blue line this year. Evason not happy with his defensive game. The offense is there for Addison, but if he's going to be a regular on the Minnesota Wild, the defense is going to have to pick it up. And if it doesn't, maybe we end up seeing a trade being made and, we see what happens there for Bill Guerin. Now, their top 5 scorers, not really any surprises here. So for Kaprizov in 67 games this year, 40 goals, 35 assists, 75 points. He could very well get 50 goals this year. 75 points in 67 games is a drop in terms of goals per game. Or points per game, I should say. But yeah, the goals are still there. And so yeah, he could be a 50-goal scorer. He could hit 90 points. He could cross the 100-point barrier again. Matt Zuccarello, 78 games, 22 goals, 45 assists, 67 points. I think playing with Kaprizov has helped his career. The same as Pavelski's been helped in Dallas by the players he's been with. And of course, that's mutually beneficial. I think Kaprizov likes Zuccarello's passing quite a bit too, and it's part of how he gets to 40 goals this past season. Matt Boldy. I like Matt Boldy. 81 games, 31 goals, 32 assists, 63 points. I think 31 goals, yeah, he can get better than that. I think 35 goals is within reach. I could see Boldy being a 40-goal scorer in his career. Eric Sinek, 78 games played, 23 goals, 38 assists, 61 points. Eric Sinek can be a very good goal scorer, but his passing game seems to have picked it up over the last couple of years. So, yeah, Eric Sinek, a pretty solid all-around option for the Minnesota Wild. And then there's Freddie Gaudreau, one of the hardest-working players in the National Hockey League. Played all 82 games, 19 goals, 19 assists, 38 points. He is the type of player to play through injury, so I'm not surprised that he played all 82 games. I wouldn't say he was necessarily healthy for all 82 games, but if the guy can skate, he goes out there and plays. So there's some good depth here. Hartman just misses the top 5 scorers. If he plays every game, he'll score more than Gaudreau. And getting Hartman back to where he was a couple years ago is really important for the Minnesota Wild. Their goaltending, I mentioned earlier, I'll mention it again now. Fleury plays more games, plays 46, a record of 24, 16, and 4. .908 save percentage. Not awful. Gustafsson, though, in 39 games, a record of 22, 9 and 7, .931 save percentage. I don't know if Gustafsson hits that again. It is tougher for a goaltender to do that the second time through the NHL, but he's certainly going to try. And if he can, Minnesota should stay above that playoff line, right? Now, the channel vote is pretty optimistic, considering this is a team that, finishes with another first-round loss, and they don't have any cap space. 8% of the channel said first or second place for Minnesota. 66%, so 2/3 of the vote went to third or fourth place. They finished third this past season, of course. Fifth or sixth, 22% of the vote went there, and 4% voted seventh or eighth for the Minnesota Wild. So some optimism here. This is a team as well that can hit. Marcus Foligno, a big part of that. 237 hits for him. Jared Spurgeon led in block shots with 179. Jonas Brodin's right there with them. Spurgeon and Brodin give them something on the blue line that I think is underrated. National Hockey League related anyways. Just that there are teams that get overlooked. Minnesota, I think, does get overlooked. Posts, both Boldy and Kaprizov had 8 posts. So again, as I've mentioned in a couple previous, those posts tell you, hey, if they can hit that net those 4 more times, or 4 more times each out of the 8, Kaprizov would have 44 and Boldy would have had an even 35. The exits are interesting. I'll talk about them because the additions, it's just maroon, right? Yeah, that's it. So it's going to be reliance on some improvement from within, and I'll talk about that over here. So exits. Matt Dumba had a rough year. We'll see if a switch of where he's playing ends up turning his game around. Klingberg exits after being a rental at the deadline. Sundqvist, Nyquist were rentals as well. I think they'd like to have kept at least one of those players, but they didn't have the cap space to do it. Mason Shaw is gone. Ryan Reeves is gone. He's off to Toronto. And Sam Steele has exited as well after a decent season. But again, Steele was bottom 6. And there were times where he was a healthy scratch as well. For next one, I picked Brock Faber. I figure, with the defense as it is, and if Addison, let's just say that the Addison situation isn't tenable. They say, you know what, Addison, we're going to move him. Maybe Faber jumps into a pretty decent spot on that blue line and really clicks for the Minnesota Wild. And then fantasy sleeper, I went with Rossi. Rossi, of course, it's been a rough start to his career. But again, with the Minnesota Wild having the cap space issues that they do, the amount of exits they've had, the fact they've only added Pat Maroon that I can find on any list anyways, might open a door for a guy like Rossi to step in because those entry-level contracts are gold at the National Hockey League level for the amount of money they save you under the cap, and Minnesota's going to need plenty of gold this coming season. Their MVP has to be Kirill the Thrill. Kirill Kaprizov is one of the most exciting players in the National Hockey League. It's interesting watching a Minnesota game because it can put you to sleep at points, but as soon as Kaprizov's on the ice, nobody has to tell you. He could go out there without his number and name on the back of his jersey, and the game all of a sudden has a lot of excitement, a lot of movement. It's fast, it's fun. I think if they can get 2 lines going that play that creative, offensive, really up-tempo style, and if they can work on their transition game, their goals scored per game will go up, and their games will become more exciting to watch for us as fans as well. Now, their schedule is an interesting one, and it's fair. September and October, they have the same number of games in both months on the road as they do at home, and they have 3 back-to-backs. So the schedule's not overly difficult, comparatively speaking, with some of the others. And so if Minnesota goes out and plays the way that we know they can, this is a team that could very well end up still being third or better in the division. But when you look at this division, it looks like both Colorado and Dallas should finish ahead of them. It's a matter of proving people wrong. Now, the dead cap money, and I know Minnesota fans don't like it. They don't want to talk about it. But it has to be mentioned if I'm going to do a season preview. You have to talk about the fact that this team has one hand tied behind its back from a salary cap perspective, because that dead cap between Parise and Suter, $14,743,588 for this year and next, so right until 2025. Now, next summer, with the salary cap likely going up by around $4 million, and that's the opinion, that's the estimate, that should help. Having the salary cap go up absolutely should help the Minnesota Wild get their team on the ice, but of course, every team's going to get that increase in the cap. So having almost $15 million of your cap hit going to players that are no longer on the team, that are now playing elsewhere. In Parese's case, he's still a UFA. There's no chance he's going back to Minnesota. But yeah, Suter's in Dallas. And so it's tough. It definitely makes things more difficult for the Minnesota Wild going forward. Their last conference final, their only conference final was 2003. So we talk about them not getting out of the first round since 2015. They haven't got out of the second round since 2003. This is where that argument of relevance comes in, with Minnesota just not being that relevant from a Stanley Cup contender perspective, right? So they're going to need to rely on Marc-Andre Fleury having a bit of a bounce back season from last year's numbers, that .908 save percentage, and they're going to need bargain contracts, and they're going to need entry-level contracts. So one thing that Minnesota will be relying on is some improvement from within, getting guys to come up who might be career AHLers. A guy like Nick Petan is still in their list, may end up being the number 4 center, right? That's just an example. And this could be a team that if you're a kid, if you're 19, 20, 21 years of age and you're close to NHL ready and you're in the Minnesota organization, you might get a better opportunity to play for them this year than you might for another team who might be outside the playoffs. But for Minnesota, if they can get those bargain contracts, they can get those kids in there, that really helps them out, and it gives them a much better chance of finishing with a record as solid as last year, especially if Gustafsson can follow up this past season with another great one, right? So it is year 4 for Dean Evason, and this is the key thing, right, when it comes to coaches, is who's on the hot seat. Evason might be. So Bruce Boudreau lasted 4 years. Mike Yeo lasts roughly 4.5 years, and they are the predecessors for Evason. So traditionally in Minnesota, outside of Jacques Lemaire, who was there for a long time, Todd Richards was then there for 2 years, and that's before Yeo comes in, and then you get Boudreau, and now you've got Evason. Some well-known coaches. Boudreau, of course, a beloved coach, but year 4 is really where the rubber meets the road for the Minnesota Wild organization. So if Minnesota gets off to a rough start, Evason's job could be affected by that. So there is some pressure to start well. And again, the schedule's fair to them, so I would totally understand if their schedule is fair and the team's record isn't any good if Guerin decides to make a change. So there's some pressure on Evason. They also dropped 10 points this past season from where they were the year before. So it does feel like for Minnesota, they're trending down ever so slightly. They need to stop that trending down this season. They need to at least keep their totals the same as last year. They also went from 5th in goals for to 22nd this past year. You can't do that. You have to get your goal scoring back up into the top half. And that's why the addition of Pat Maroon is an interesting one, because Maroon's not going to add goals. Losing Dumba, losing Klingberg, there's some offensive creativity on the blue line that it gets set aside. Although, again, as I said, Dumba had a rough year. But Klingberg, if they'd been able to afford to keep him, who knows? But again, they couldn't afford to keep him. At the very least, though, they did keep Marcus Johansson. We'll see if Johansson plays as well for them to start the season as he did after he was acquired at the deadline. And they didn't lose as many players in the offseason as one might have expected with the salary cap issues this team has. So when we talk about Minnesota teams, and it really is remarkable that when you look at the big team, the big leagues in professional sports in North America, Minnesota's had a tough time. No major titles since 1991. That was the Minnesota Twins. And that was a Twins team that, as I remember it, they had, I think, 81 wins, 82. There wasn't very many wins for that Minnesota team, and they kind of came out and won when it was unexpected. They have no Super Bowl wins for the Minnesota Vikings. They've had Vikings teams that have gotten to the Super Bowl, not able to win it. And, of course, the Minnesota Timberwolves, an organization which has had tremendous struggles in the NBA. So Minnesota-based teams have had their issues. One thing that stands out with the Minnesota Wild, of course, it is the state of hockey. And if the Minnesota Wild could go to a Stanley Cup final, and of course, and this is going to sound odd, but if they could win the Stanley Cup, that would be absolutely huge. I will say not only for Minnesota, but for the National Hockey League, because other teams in Minnesota haven't been champions. So you could really market a Stanley Cup champion Minnesota Wild team, which is already selling tickets very, very well to fans around North America. They have a small town feel to it because, again, it's Minnesota. It sort of reminds me of like the Green Bay Packers and football. And so, yeah, I find myself hoping that the Minnesota Wild finally get over the hump. Can they do it? Again, with the losses this offseason and with the team looking largely the same, just at its core to what it was last year, It's going to depend on Kaprizov getting over the hump in the playoffs and getting that support in the playoffs as well, and Gustafsson having back-to-back tremendous seasons, or Fleury bouncing back from what was an up-and-down season and just having a really consistent, excellent season in what is the final year of his contract. So, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Are you of the belief that they're going to be top 4 in the division? 74% of the channel said yes. Or are you in the 26% that say, yeah, I don't think they're going to make it that far? Let me know your thoughts. Hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.